Keep it going. Keep it going. This, bring it round on the hose straight now. And they're coming down the final floor. Go. Okay. Yes, no problem at all.
Okay, so can everybody hear? Oh yeah, you can definitely hear us, that's fine. So thank you for doing this, Brian. It's been great to meet you. One of my favourite facts that I learned while researching for today was that back in the early days of the radiophonic workshop, when it had kind of first been set up, the BBC would only allow staff to work there for 3 months, was it? Because they were worried that the electronic noises would drive them mental.
Head of program operations had a friend who was a brain surgeon, and his brain surgeon said, all those strange noises, they're bound to be mental problems. And there were. I'm here to prove it.
So, well, with that in mind, what was it that first attracted you to kind of work at the radiophonic workshop?
I was doing my national service in the Royal Air Force in Northern Ireland, and there was a broadcast of a program called Private Dreams and Public Nightmares, and it was an experimental broadcast written by Freddie Bradman, and Radiophonic Workshop put it together. The producer was Donald McWhinney, and as he introduced the program, he ended by saying, somebody suggested we should play it backwards, and that might be quite a good idea. And I heard that and I thought, that sounds like a really great place, but I was trained as an actor, so I was going to go straight back into the theatre. But that was my first introduction to Radiophonic Workshop. Then I finished being an actor. I joined the BBC as a studio manager in drama department. And at the end of 2 years, we were all sent off to the engineering training school, where we endured 12 weeks of being taught about magnetic resonance and all sorts of other wonderful things we would never, ever need in the rest of our lives. And after that, we were sent on the tour of the BBC, different departments, to decide which department we were interested in. Now, Madalena Fagandini had just done a time signal, which is when the BBC used to break down, you'd have a potter's wheel and things. And Madalena had done this little jingly thing. George Martin heard it and said, let's make a record. So with glacial speed, BBC agreed, and then it was actually published as Time Beat by Ray Capo. The other side of the disc was Whilst in Orbit. And it caused a fair amount of interest. And then Desmond, who was the boss of the Radiophonic Workshop, he was invited to go to the radio show, which happened every year. And he did his lecture. And it just happened that my people who'd been on the course with me were there as he was practicing his thing. And knowing that I'd come from the theatre, he asked me to introduce him. So I did, and then I applied when I got back to my own department to join the Radiophonic Workshop on a freelance attachment, as you say, and stayed for 9 years. And that's how I came to the Radiophonic Workshop.
It strikes me that, so you trained as an actor,
Yeah.
and am I right, your national service with the RAF was in submarine detection, is that right? So kind of
Yeah,
sonar and stuff like that?
I went from sonar. It's a system where you drop these things in the water and drop 3, and you can pinpoint a submarine. And it was not a glamorous job, but you know, it passed 2 years before I could get out.
But I think like in that combination of acting, so you understand drama and you understand theatre, and you understand sound because you've done that
Yeah.
work with sonar. The radiophonic workshop seems like the perfect place for you. Did it feel like that at the time when you joined up?
Yes, so I'd worked with Magdalena, and I'd done, because I was a drama studio manager, I'd done a couple of plays, which, Cocktails d'Orphée and Out of Love's Living Time, and I loved her work. So I just couldn't wait to get the radiophonic workshop and try and have a play myself.
So you started radiophonic workshop in 1962, right?
Yeah.
And a few months later, Doctor Who enters production,
Yeah.
and obviously you play a very key role in that. I think we all know, you know, the key up the piano string and all that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But I'm really interested in how the process worked. So at what point did you kind of come into the production? So was it the planning meetings, or did you do it as a dub
No,
once
no.
they filmed?
First of all, we have to just rewind a little bit. Warris and Verity wanted a signature tune by Ron Grainer. And unfortunately, Ron very publicly said, I'm never going to write another television signature tune. They also wanted to be played by a group, French group, called Structure Sonore, and they specialized in instruments made with glass tubes and aluminium and things. When they found out what the fee for Structure Sonore was, it was larger than the entire program for the production. So Lionel Salter, who was head of television music at the time, he said, why don't you go see my friend Desmond at the radiophonic workshop? So they explained what they wanted, and they wanted a signature tune, and they wanted sound. And Desmond said, well, I know Ron very well, and I'd worked with Ron on a program called Giants of Steam. So he said, I'll ring Ron now. So he rang Ron, and Ron said, yeah, I'd love to do something, especially with the radiophonic workshop. So he agreed to do that. And Delia Derbyshire, assisted by Dick Mills, helped the realization of that. Now, I was sent off to another studio, which was next door, to do the time machine. And that was a little bit puzzling at first, you know. Rockets go great because you go bang, whoosh, and then rising note. But where does the time machine go? It can go up, it doesn't go down, it doesn't go sideways. But time comes and time goes. So there's a technique. If you make a noise and you put feedback on it, which is where it goes from one tape recorder and it's played back on another and then played back to the original tape recorder, the sound appears to go away from you. Now if you turn that backwards, it appears to come towards you. So there's a technique I was going to use. Now the sound. I'd done a program off a radio called Survivors, where people were trapped in the hull of a boat that's gone aground on the rocks. So I first used the piano string idea, slowed down such a lot, so it was cavernous. That worked well. And there was a phrase, I don't know where it came from, whether it was Huxley, or what was in my head, or Veritas or Warris's, called the rending of the fabric of time and space. And I thought, well, that sound is great. But instead of slowing the sound down, we speeded it up with various notes, started putting it together, and we added all sorts of little pings that came and went, and also sort of things that came and went. So this was all done in sync with a piece of experimental video feedback by Bernard Lodge. And so all of those timings, and in fact the time of the picture, is all based on the timings of that original piece of work by Bernard Lodge. Now, they came back several weeks later, and they loved the signature show, and they were just blown out of their minds. And I, in my pig-headed youth, decided that TARDIS would not have a rising note. So they were quite underwhelmed when I played it. And they said, I explained, why has it got rising note on it? And I said, well, you know, I just didn't feel it was right. It was too cliche. And they said, it needs a rising note. And I have to say, the entire progress of the rising note took 10 minutes, having spent 3 weeks putting the TARDIS together. So that's how it all started, and of course it's still going. So you only ever hear the first little bits and the last little bits, all the wonderful composition was only ever played in full on Unearthly Child, and the next time it will be played is at my funeral, consigned to the flat.
Is that genuinely the plan?
That is actually genuinely the plan.
Well, not brilliant in the sense you're going to that's a brilliant epitaph, I think, you know.
Mark Ayres, who's the archivist of the Point, is actually preparing the CD for my funeral. When you get to my age, best be prepared.
So, you kind of, I guess, touched on it. So it was kind of a collaboration with the director. I think it was much script notes in terms of what sounds the writers wanted, or was it?
Well, it really depended on the director. Some people said, well, I'll leave it to you. Other people were very sure about the sort of thing they wanted. Although it was very difficult in those days, you know, we're talking about 1963. Not many people had even heard any electronic music before. And I specialised in atmosphere, so that when you got a planet, I tried to imagine what technology would have been used on that planet, and to create an atmosphere which reflected the action, rather than actual sounds, except things like ray guns and sonic screwdrivers. And I could never remember why gun and sonic screwdriver. So I changed it every time there was a different sort of technology and what they wanted it to do. If it cut metal, it would make a lasery sound, and if it was sort of trying to decode a time lock, then it would be a clicky sound. So there's no definitive sound. Sonic screwdriver.
At this point, I want to thank you, because The Mind Robber is one of my all-time favourite Doctor Who stories. It's the first one that kind of made an impact on me as a kid, watching it in the 90s on BBC Two. And I think a lot of that is the soundscape you create in that first episode, where the TARDIS is going, they're stuck in this kind of strange white void, and you create this kind of quite atmospheric noise of the void. But The Mind Robber, if I remember rightly, doesn't have a musical score. It's all your kind of, what I think you call theatre of sound.
I think theatre of sound is I've never considered myself to be a composer. I consider myself to be an actor in the theatre of sound.
Which is a lovely way of looking at it. But obviously you did move into producing music though. So obviously in '66 you do the White Noise collaboration in Electric Storm with Delia Derbyshire.
We were moonlighting a bit. Desmond was very keen that we shouldn't become too introspective, so he encouraged us to try different art forms. I did quite a lot of theatre stuff, and I also worked with Peter Logan's mechanical ballet. Did a lot of stuff for him. And at one point, I think I had about 3 shows going on in the West End that I'd done the sound for. I was sided with Rosie, Brief Lives, with the Royalty Trees, and and Ron Grader's musicals on the Shaftesbury. It was I didn't last very long. It was quite disastrous.
What was the What was the musical that Ron Grainer?
It was called On the Level. It only ran for a few weeks.
So what was that kind of with David Borhaus and Delia Derbyshire? What was that kind of collaboration like? You know, working on that album together.
It was very strange. So Delia and David wrote all the tunes. I voiced over the dead biker and made all the neighbours' complaints for He Had Come the Fleas. And I found the guy who wrote the lyrics, a guy called John Wren MacDonald, who's still alive, living in New Mexico, and writes. He wrote a book called, I think it was called Yank in London, or Yanks, or just Yank, which is still available in Amazon. And it's a very interesting sort of portrait of London in the 60s. And he talks about meeting me at the fashion show. Did I did a fashion show for ICI when they introduced Terylene. And I met one of the scientists, and I said, why is it if you wear Terylene trousers, you always end up with black dirt on your legs? And he said, we don't talk about that. Anyway, John was one of the models, and we met, and he talks about meeting me and how he got involved in White Noise.
And when you left the Radiofront workshop in 72,
yeah.
Sorry, 71, you set up Electrobond Studios.
That's right.
And you produced more records, and you worked with Dudley Simpson, who's another sort of big...
Oh yeah, our first thing was Further Thoughts on the Classic, which was a sort of Walter Carlos thing, but not really as good as Walter Carlos. And then I was working with the Ballet Rumba with Christopher Bruce, for whom I did, I think, 3 ballets, sound scores. And he invited a choreographer over from New York, Louis Falco, his name was, and he brought with him his own composer, Bert Alcantara. And I loved Bert's score for the ballet, and I said, why don't you come to my studio and let's extend it as an LP, which was called Zygote. It was what I actually called Tubular Bells with Walls, but unfortunately not a lot of people liked it. It only sold about 2,000, but people still refer to it. It's like White Noise. It didn't sell very well. It became a cult album, and over the years it probably has sold quite well. But because we were at the beginnings of things, most of our competitors are dead now, so we did something. We put a marker down.
And I mean, in terms of like being at the start of something, you worked with John Lewis on a couple of albums, and I was listening to them a couple of days ago, and the album Where Are We, Captain?
Yeah.
Sounds very, very similar to a lot of the work that would then get done on 80s Doctor Who in terms of scoring it.
Yes.
So, I mean, when you go back to the workshop in the 80s, that's obviously John Nathan Turner comes down and wants you guys to do some music.
Came and came to me and said, I was by then organizer or head of a different workshop, I can't remember. he said, I'd really like some of your composers to do music for Doctor Who. So, now Dick was still working with Dudley, and Dick was, I have to say, one of the most indiscreet people I've ever met. So John said, Dick mustn't find out, because I'm going to let Dudley know I'm getting other composers in, but it's a secret. So it was the best kept secret, the only one he never sussed out. So I got Peter Howell and Paddy Kingsland to do demos for John, and John liked them, and that was it. It wasn't until John Nathan Taylor was really miffed, because Dudley had done Doctor Who for so long, and he just agreed to take over Blake's 7 as well, and John thought that was disloyal, and he didn't want Doctor Who to sound like Blake's 7. So he took him out to lunch, and Dudley was saying, oh, yeah, John's going to take me out to lunch, and he's probably going to offer me the next series as well. I was very miffed to find out he wasn't doing it.
And John Lewis was originally scheduled to do some
John
work.
was going to do one story, and John unfortunately developed AIDS, and he died in 1984. He was at the time in the French Hospital in Bristol, and I just mentioned to him that he was doing Doctor Who, or he was supposed to be doing it. By then, it was getting rather late towards it. So, John's death, it was leaked by a nurse he'd spoken to. And that was about the time the Sun produced a list of symptoms of AIDS, which in fact were virtually the same as the symptoms of the common cold. So everyone panicked. I had the News of the World on the phone. The first thing when I got in the morning, my deputy answered all the phones. I then had a hysterical director who had met John to commission him, who declared that I had endangered her life and the life of her family. This was a quarter hour after just learned about the death of my best friend. So that was really quite a bad time, but fortunately or unfortunately, within days, a more famous person died of AIDS. So John was forgotten. But John was a very good musical director. He also had done things for Ballet Robert. In fact, strangely enough, I was coming down from a rehearsal with Christopher Bruce, and I passed the music studio of Ballet Robert and heard this amazing piece of music. Didn't know who'd done it. I'd met John briefly at the party some years ago, and I just loved it. I stood outside till the rehearsal finished and came out, and it was John. And he then asked if I would advise him on how to buy a synthesizer. And in those days, most of the music shops, they knew the name synthesizer, didn't know anything about them. So I went with John up Tottenham Court Road, and we decided that even John knew more about synthesizers than most of the salespeople. So we went back to coffee at the studio, and I thought, Delia's gone now. Why don't you join me in Electron? So John did, and we did Where Are We, Captain, and New Atlantis.
Which are terrific albums. So when you returned to the Radiophonic Workshop in the 80s, aside from composing the incidental music, John Nathan Turner also asked you to appear at the infamous Longleats event. What are your memories of that chaos, should we call it?
John looked at Bill and rang me up and he said, I'm doing a launch of this event at Longleat, which I knew nothing about. Now Dick knew about it, but he couldn't bother to tell me. So there we were at the press conference, and then John Letton did it. And here in the orange tree is the radiophonic marquee, at which point I'd just taken a sip of white wine, which went all over the place. And so we agreed to do it, and I was assured that when we got there, we'd have a complete studio set up. Now, I don't believe many people in the BBC when they say, I'm sure you will have. So I decided we would take tape recorders, a mixing desk, and when we got to the radiophonic marquee, there were two 13-amp sockets. So we started off with a loudspeaker, only one loudspeaker, and our stuff was in stereo, a loudspeaker from a local radio shop, which was hanging around in his basement because he'd never been able to sell it, which we managed virtually to fuse almost immediately. We actually got it working, and I started to introduce what was going on, and the head of Radio Enterprises, or BBC Enterprises, and the Marquis de Bois stepped in, and I said, I must apologize for the quality of sound, because I was assured by Television Enterprises that I would have a complete setup here, but I haven't. And suddenly he disappeared, and 20 minutes later we had a piece of BBC loudspeakers amplifiers, and I said it was fine. It was great fun to do. Somebody went up to Desmond Briscoe, a little boy, and he said, didn't you used to be Desmond Briscoe? And Desmond looked down and he said, as far as I know, I still am.
I suppose you mentioned Dick Mills a couple of times, and obviously he takes over from you.
Yes.
On the special sounds side of things.
When I went back, I said, I'm not touching Doctor Who.
Yeah.
I had enough to do. Because I went back, having set up Electron Studio, and when I got back to the Radiophonic Workshop, I found virtually hardly any equipment had changed since I'd left 9 years earlier. And I was at the board, and I said, you know, I will only come back if I have a free hand to update the technology. And everyone said, oh, there isn't a budget for things like that, but I was determined. So then I went back, yeah.
And but in terms of Dick Mills succeeding you,
Yeah.
was that your suggestion?
That was my decision,
Yeah.
Well, Dick is very good. I mean, he's not only pretty good, he's very entertaining as well when he comes to Doctor Who things. And so I think he was very worried that I would take it back up, but I decided that my project was to reform the Radiophonic Workshop, and he could carry on doing Doctor Who as long as he wanted.
In terms of, obviously we talked about the fan event and sort of kids coming up to Desmond Briscoe and things like that. The Radiophonic Workshops had quite an incredible kind of cultural impact over the years.
Yes.
It influenced, Orbital, Aphex Twin, so many sort of musical acts that have kind of come after that. Everyone
claims they were influenced by us. How much so I don't know, but I think what we did was to change the ears of a generation. When we first started, people say, oh, that sounds like a saxophone, or that sounds like this. After they got used to all the strange things, most adults hated it. Most children had been doing music and drama, and so there was one particular thing that they used to be ready for a workshop to do sounds and jingles and things for it. and they would bring school children in into one of the studios at Whooverville and play it to them, and then they'd act out in the thing. There was a famous one called The Magic Carpet. It was written by Janet Worsley, and the kids were supposed to get the magic carpet. It was going to take off, and it was going to go through a thunderstorm. And when the producers heard it, they said, "Oh, that thunderstorm's far too violent. And the children would be frightened. You must tone it down." So they toned it down. And then after the studio session, when they came out, said, "The children want you to make the thunderstorm really big." So it all had to be put back and made even worse. Because the kids weren't frightened, it was the teachers.
And I suppose sort of creating sounds that scare children was, I guess, your whole bread and butter for the first 9 years of on Doctor Who, I suppose.
We got a lot of complaints about the Zalbies. Because they were high-pitched and children tended to go like that. It couldn't really hurt them because television broadcast very high frequencies. In those days it was all a bit muffled. Yeah, that was one, and of course I was accused of ruining the throats of children going about saying, "Exterminate, exterminate." That was another voice treatment which I developed for the Daleks, which was based on a program called Sword and Stars, which was a radio program, in which there was a butler called Jones Robot, and Jones was a very posh, polite English butler. I used my own voice for it. And we modulated that at a very high frequency. With the Daleks, it was different. We realized that I was using very low frequency at 30 cycles. It doesn't really work on consonants, but it does work on vowels. So that's why Richard Martin and Peter Hawkins, who was a brilliant voiceover guy, we decided that if he extended all the vowels, so exterminate, then the treatment worked, and set a whole fashion. And they're still using the Daleks voice today, just as they're still using the TARDIS today, and they're still using the Daleks control room today. So I reckon they must be the longest running sound effects in history of television.
How do you, I guess Clive, but how do you feel about the fact that obviously they're still using those sounds today, and the idea that I suppose if they were to ever change that, it would be sacrilegious, I feel like now.
Yeah, I think that's what Russell T. Davies thought when he revived Doctor Who. There were certain things which he would not allow them to change, and the TARDIS was one, and the Daleks, of course, and the Daleks control room. Yeah, they were set. I'm surprised they could be changed now, because all the original Doctor Who fans are aging, just as I am. And their kids won't accept anything new. I rather like the idea that they're keeping their 1 foot at the beginning. Yeah.
Well, it's the fabric of the whole show. It's the fabric of the whole show. The sounds that you created in the 60s, I think it would be lost.
I never thought I would be sitting here, 63 years later, thinking, gosh, people are still interested.
Well, people are still interested, and I think I'm going to ask some aging fans if they've got any questions. Yes, gentleman in the red shirt, can you speak loud so I can hear?
Two parts really. Thank you very much, sir. So before the radiophonic era, were you familiar with Forbidden Planet and the electronic tonalities in that feature film? Because that was quite pioneering. And then how do you think the British home computer revolution, putting Spectrums and Amigas and BBC-Bs into young people's hands, contributed to the creativity of electronic arts and music.
Did you get that, Brad? Right?
No, that's
So,
right.
when you started, had you seen the film Forbidden Planet, which had quite an electric
That
story?
was wonderful. I loved that film.
Did that have any influence on you and how you kind of
No,
approached
because
it?
they had much better technology.
And on the technology part, the second part was, how do you think the home computer sort of revolution had kind of changed the sort of electronic music and electronic sound?
Well, the first change, of course, was voice control synthesizer that Merlin Butler had developed in America. There had been a synthesizer before. I think CBC had built one, and it was the size of an aircraft hangar. And Morton Subotnick had used that as well. The really Water Workshop, when it started, really had very little equipment. It had a budget of £2,000. Half of it spent on a filter, which filtered in thirds of octaves. Unfortunately, they could only buy half of it because the money ran out, so we never had half of that. It had a lot of oscillators which had been put together by BBC engineers and a very primitive keying unit. So you had to tune each oscillator separately and then key it. You could alter the decay, but you couldn't even alter the attack. So there were semi-professional tape recorders in the room. There was a mixing desk that had been in the Albert Hall during the war. This was a passive mixing desk, which meant if you faded up another channel, you had to compensate on the main control by 3 dB, otherwise all the signal dropped. There was one BBC recording machine. There was an aged Ampex, and there were 2 amazing machines called Motor Secoche. Now these had been built in Switzerland at the end of the war, and they were allegedly built by a motorcycle manufacturer who wanted to get into recording. And they stood about this big, there were 2 of them, at central console. And they took a good 8 to 10 seconds to get up to speed. But once they got up to speed, they ran absolutely perfectly in sync together, which was very rare in those days. But the most interesting part of that was to service them. You press the button on front of the decks, and they rose majestically. The engineer would have to get behind through a little gate and sort of work on the mechanisms like that. And the favourite trick was that we play a producer, is accused, and standing in front of the sheet, secretly press the button, and they watch their faces as the machines basically there with their precious program. There were also semi-professional machines. There was an echo machine, which was a large drum with magnetic heads around it. It had been designed by BBC Engineering. Unfortunately, it crackled like crazy as magnetic heads revolved against the drum. But the drum was housed in a drawer, really heavy, and so it was always used as a spaceship doors, you know, drum. What else do we have? Really not a lot, but a lot of nerve and a lot of love.
And when you came back in the 80s, kind of revitalised the workshop, I guess, with new technology, and sort of computers had come on a bit by then, so that changed anything, or?
No, they hadn't come. Computers were still very difficult. I think the Apple invited me to see one a computer, and said, "This is, you know, a great musical tool." And it sounded more like a doorbell than anything else. You couldn't really alter the sounds. It wasn't until much later when a Macintosh was first introduced, I think 84.
Right, yeah.
When I'd come back in 79. When I came back, I wanted, at my own studio, we developed a polyphonic keyboard, all synthesized or monophonic up to that point. We'd also developed a system for recording voltage control digitally, up to 16 tracks on 1/4-inch tape. And we'd also developed more stable oscillators, more stable filters, where we could control the attack, decay. We could make a band pass filter, band reject filter, top filter, bottom filter. And these were made under the name Wavemaker, which is the name we adopted in our albums. So I went back and we decided that the Synthi 100, which was a big synthesizer, had to, it was really beyond its proper service life, and it was, Dudley was using it like virtually 5 days a week, so the rest of the department didn't get much access. So I decided it had to go, and we were going to build a new synthesizer using all these new advanced modules. It was going to be called the Phoenix. I took Synthi 100 apart, much to the dismay of most of the staff. Cardiff University had one, and their sequencer had broken, so I gave them our digital sequencer. And then something very strange happened. It's called MIDI, Musical Instrument Digital Interface, which completely blew voltage control out of the water. Voltage control here, I'm afraid I still refer to as buzz and fart. And suddenly, the Japanese came in with stable things, polyphonic keyboards, the ability to remember sounds. So that changed it, and then the next thing to happen was the computer. I went to see first Mac, I think. There was one in a computer shop in Bishopsgate in London, and I went in and I talked to them about it. And I said, "We'd like to borrow one. We would like to look at it." They were very snooty. And I said, "Well, we might buy more than one." "Oh, no, we don't think so." So I rang up another small company in Kent, and there was one on my desk the next day, and they provided all our computers for the next few months. The thing was that people were developing music software in America, but it was all very slow, and it wasn't really until the Mac speeded up, the VSE, and suddenly it really became possible to use computers. One of the nice things about computers was it would remember the controls for the sound. So trying to find a sound again was no problem, it was all there. And the other thing was that you could actually play the music and then change all the sounds. The music was still there. That was one thing that stuck with me. And the other really major step forward was Yamaha and Akai developing digital recording, and Sony to a lesser extent. So instead of having 24-track machines, which cost the earth, you could record 24 tracks, whatever, on a hard disk. And that changed everything drastically. And I was very lucky, because when I went back, Aubrey Singer had taken over as managing director radio, and he walked into Broadcasting House and basically said, this place is a shithole. The wallpaper's peeling off, the carpets are threadbare. I've just come back from Japan and I've seen the future. So I was able, he brought also a load of people from television, high flyers, sort of people who follow you into a swing door and come out in front of you. But there's one guy in particular who became head of resources, a guy called John Duteau, and he was a very friend of Michael Trekland, who later became a DG. The radio front of which I've never had a budget. It survived on what I used to call fag ends and lollipops. A fag end was money that had not been spent by another department, and it was left over, so they put it all together and give us a bit. Lollipops were things they used to shove into Desmond's mouth to shut him up because he hadn't got the equipment. So this new guy, head of resources, and I whinged constantly about not having a budget, said, oh, would you mind if I brought Director of Resources Television over? This was Michael Trekland. He came over and got the full Hodgson whinge. And said, okay, I want you to write a report about the future for the next 10 years, which I what you'd like to do. So I did the report, and being bold, knowing that if you ask for something at BBC, you usually go half. I asked for 160,000 a year, and he said, well, I'll give you 60,000, providing radio comfort for the rest of it. So I've topped it up to 100,000. And that was just magic, because computers were happening, all the new recording modules were happening, and I was able, from what were 2 rooms, to create 6 studios, which was one for every composer. That meant they had access to it 24 hours. In the old days, you had access maybe 3 hours a day, and you had to clear off and let somebody else do it. And so working through the night was just the norm. It still actually became the norm, especially on things like Doctor Who, when they would actually give you a tape of the program 3 days before they were going to dub it. Dudley Simpson had a thing, he said, do you want it good or do you want it Wednesday? And the reply usually was, right, so you'd ever go on Tuesday afternoon. So we'd be working through the weekend, through the night and do it.
Well, I think we soon have to clear off to let somebody else use the stage. But before we go, I just want to ask you one last question. The noise of the TARDIS is obviously, it's ingrained in our cultural heritage now. And many writers have tried to kind of write down what it is. So I've got three depictions of what that is. And I want you to tell me what you think the one that sums up the noise of the TARDIS the best, okay? So we've got, first of all, vorp vorp, okay? Second,
it's V. Oh,
yep. A wheezing, groaning sound.
Wheezing, where is that?
Or metallic thrumming.
I think metallic thrumming is about
Ladies and gentlemen,